right, let's talk about the social psychology of language. Now, one of the most important aspects of living in the social world is language. Language is by far the most used medium of social interaction. Through the use of language, people can convey almost an unlimited number of ideas to other people, from simple information about how to get to the nearest grocery store to very complex philosophical ideas. But what is language? Well, language is a socially acquired system of verbal and nonverbal symbols used to convey meanings. The socially acquired part of this definition denotes the fact that no humans are born with any knowledge of language. Rather, they learn it by being socialized by other members of a society. Now, although when most people think of language, they think of verbal language or speech. However, language can also come in written forms and in nonverbal forms, such as body language and interpersonal spacing. Language is a system of symbols, which are objects used to refer to other objects. For example, the English word table isn't really a table. Rather, it is a symbol for another object, namely, a piece of furniture with four legs that people can place items on. The symbols of a language are arbitrary. That is, the symbols that people choose to denote other objects don't have anything inherently to do with the object, but rather people come to associate the symbol with the object through an implicit social agreement. This is shown by the fact that different languages use different words to refer to the same object. For example, a piece of furniture with four legs and a flat top in English is table, but in German it's Tisch, and in Spanish it's mesa. Linguists distinguish between five basic components of verbal language: phonemes, morphemes, semantic syntax, and vocalics. Phonemes are the various sounds used in a particular language. For example, the English language contains the phoneme linguists call the voiceless dental fricative, or as it is commonly known, the th sound, as in the word thing. All spoken language consists of a variety of phonemes. However, most languages don't use all the sounds that humans can make vocally. For instance, the rolled R that is common in Spanish isn't used in German or English, and the k sound that is common in many African languages isn't used in English either. Also, although the th phoneme is common in English, most languages actually don't use this phoneme. Morphemes are the various sounds of a language that have standalone meanings. The most common types of morphemes are words. For example, the combination of the phonemes th, I, and ing produce the word thing in the English language. However, not all morphemes are words. For instance, the morpheme aha in the English language has a standalone meaning even though technically it isn't a word. Semantics are the meanings that the morphemes of a language convey. In other words, semantics is basically the study of definitions of words and other morphemes. For example, the morpheme bird in the English language has a specific meaning because it is a symbol of something else, such as an animal that has feathers and lays eggs to reproduce, or an offensive hand gesture. Syntax is the rules used to construct meaningful statements in a language. For example, in English, it is common to construct an understandable sentence in a subject-verb form, while other languages construct understandable sentences in verb-subject form. In short, syntax is a fancy word for grammar. Vocalics, also known as paralanguage, is all of the non-morpheme aspects of speech that convey meaning. Some examples of paralanguage include the loudness at which something is said, the pitch in which something is said, the speed in which something is said, the emphasis, breathiness in which something is said. Paralanguage can give the same morpheme entirely different meanings. Like the word dude, if I said dude or dude, I said the exact same word, but how I said it, the vocalics of it, denotes different meanings. Now, while most language is verbal, some language is nonverbal. People also convey meaning and information through nonverbal language, and that's made up of three components. The first main component of nonverbal language is body language. Body language is all the various silent movements of the body that convey meaning. There are several examples of body language. For example, emotional expressions can convey whether a person is angry, sad, or happy without the person having to say a word. Another example of body language is posture. People's posture can convey quite a lot of meaning. For instance, sitting up straight as an arrow in class conveys to others that a person is alert and paying attention to the material. And slouching in class conveys to others that the person is tired and not alert. Hand gestures are another example of body language. High fives, middle fingers, gang signs, and handshakes can all convey meaning and information to others without a person having to say a word. The second main component of nonverbal language is interpersonal spacing. Interpersonal spacing refers to how people situate themselves in space in relation to others. Social psychologists find that interpersonal spacing often conveys people's relationship status with others. For example, social psychologists have identified four major interpersonal zones among middle-class Americans that convey relationship status. The first is public distance, which is about 12 to 25 feet. This distance is used when people don't have any relationship with each other. For instance, fans don't have any sort of personal relationship with the bands that play on stage. Social distance, which is around 4 to 12 feet, conveys a formal relationship between individuals. For instance, many people doing business transactions usually are interpersonally spaced in this way. Personal distance, which is about 1.5 to 2 feet, is the interpersonal space used among friends and relatives. Intimate distance, which is about 0 inches or touching each other to 18 inches, is the interpersonal spacing used between individuals who share intimacy, such as a mother and a child or two lovers. Social psychologists find that violations of interpersonal space often cause people to feel tense, awkward, and embarrassed and stressed. People's interpersonal space almost seems sacred to them. That is, it is something that they highly value and treasure, and when others violate it, it makes them feel tense, anxious, awkward, embarrassed, and stressed. Some social psychologists even argue that people trying to protect their interpersonal space is making it difficult to fight the current energy crisis. Many people don't want to take mass transportation like buses, subways, and commuter trains because people don't want their personal spaces violated. Social psychologists do find that people experience high levels of stress when riding on a crowded bus, subway, or commuter train, and this stress is often caused by having to sit close to unfamiliar people. The third main component of nonverbal language is personal effects. Personal effects refer to the use of material objects to convey meaning to others. There are many examples of personal effects. For instance, consider clothing. People can convey a lot of meaning and information through the clothes that they wear, from the type of music they like, to how hip they are on the latest fashion trends, to whether or not they belong to the armed services. Or consider jewelry. The most simple example of this, of course, is a wedding band. This conveys to others that one is married without having to say a word. I put a wedding ring on another finger, it changes the whole meaning. No other species in existence has the capacity for language that humans have. It's not even close. The reason that humans have such a capacity for language is because having language helped early humans survive. Social psychologists have identified a number of the reasons how having the capacity for language did help humans survive. First, language frees people from the constraints of the here and now. Using language, people can communicate about things that happened in the past, things that are happening right now, and things that will happen in the future. This allowed humans to easily coordinate their behavior with others, such as during a hunt or while gathering food. Also, since language is somewhat free from the concrete world, language allowed people to refer things that weren't immediately present. For instance, if a person wanted to convey that he saw a tiger a mile down the road, he wouldn't have to point to an actual tiger to do so. Rather, he could just say the morphemes, "There's a tiger down the road." This ability of spoken language also helped humans survive by facilitating coordination among one another. The second reason humans evolved the capacity for language is because a language allowed people to communicate to others about experiences others have not directly experienced. For example, although a person may not have experienced directly the joy one experiences when having a baby or getting married, using language allows them to experience these things vicariously. Being able to communicate to others about experiences that they haven't had is one of the ways humans learn, which is an important ability in terms of survival. For example, an early human can convey to others the nausea he experienced when he ate a certain berry, even though these others had never eaten the berries themselves. A third reason humans evolved the capacity for language is because language enabled humans to preserve, transmit, and create practical knowledge and culture. Through the use of language, humans could convey information about what plants to eat, how to hunt, and how to build fires to future generations, which increased later generations' chances of survival. Language is important in the thinking process. When people think, they often do so through language. For example, people say the items that they need in their head as they push their carts through a grocery store. And when people read, they often say in their heads the words that are on the page. Some social psychologists even argue that language has such a strong influence on people's thinking that it can actually have an effect on how people think and what they can actually think about. This is commonly called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after two linguistic anthropologists who came up with this idea. According to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the languages that people speak make particular types of thinking easier or harder because language influences what people can actually think about. In other words, if there isn't a word or a set of words in a language for a particular concept or thing, then it makes it hard for people to actually think about this concept or thing. For example, consider color. In the English language, there are many words for different colors, as anyone who's been to a paint store knows. Because of this, people who speak English can think about and differentiate many different types of colors. However, people who speak languages with fewer words for color have a harder time thinking about and differentiating different types of colors in their minds because they simply don't have the words in their language to think about it. There is some evidence for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. For example, consider Hanunu, an indigenous language spoken in the Philippines. This language has over 92 names for rice, which allows people who speak this language to convey information about the size, textures, and colors of different types of rice than people who speak languages with only a few names for different types of rice. Thus, people who speak Hanunu can think about and differentiate different types of rice much more easily than speakers of English can. The language of numbers helps people perform complex mathematics. While English speakers tend to take the existence of the 10 digits of 0 through 9 and their various combinations for granted, some languages only have a few words for numbers, such as 1 and more than 1. Social psychologists have shown that the words for numbers in a language can influence thinking. For example, consider the Pariah, an indigenous group of people living in the Amazon jungle in South America. Their language only has 2 words for numbers, 1 and 2. A researcher went to this group and lined up several batteries and asked a member of the tribe to count them. The Pariah did well when the line contained 2 or 3 batteries. If there were 2 batteries, they would just say 2. If there were 3 batteries, they would say 1, 2. However, they had much more difficult time if there were more than 3 batteries in the line. For example, if there were 13 batteries in the line, to capture this in their language, the Pariah would have to say, in English basically, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, which can be quite difficult to do. If the results of this study and others are any indication, that it would seem that without the 10 digits that exist in English and other languages, people who speak these languages would have a difficult time counting beyond 3, much less performing the complicated mathematics involved in science, business, and industry. Now, exactly how does language work? That is, what do humans do when they use language in social interactions? And how does language influence these social interactions? Philosophers and social psychologists have debated these questions throughout the years. Many of these thinkers argue that language works simply as a conduit of meaning. According to the conduit of meaning view of language, people transform their thoughts and feelings into morphemes or nonverbal gestures, and others decode or interpret these morphemes and gestures to understand the thoughts and feelings the other person is trying to convey. The conduit of meaning view of language is a very commonsensical view of language, and it's how most people believe language works. The conduit of meaning view of language in pictorial form. According to this view, a speaker has various thoughts and feelings that she wants to convey to another person. To do this, the speaker transforms her thoughts and feelings into words and sends them to another person through spoken language. Then the other person receives the message about the other person's thoughts and feelings through his sense of hearing or his sense of sight. Then the hearer decodes the words in the message to try to figure out what the speaker is trying to convey. As an example of the conduit view of language, consider a person who feels hungry and wants to let this feeling be known to another person. To do this, a person transforms what they are feeling into words, in particular, I'm hungry. The other person hears, I'm hungry. And then the person decodes this message for meaning, which in this case would be the fact that the other person is hungry. That's what they are feeling. Which is very important because it's hard to look at a person and tell that they are actually hungry. We cannot directly observe this feeling state. Now, while there is some validity to the conduit view of language, some social psychologists have argued that it is a bit unrealistic because decoding people's talk and gestures is not always a straightforward process. According to many social psychologists, this is because spoken languages and gestures are inherently indexical. Indexicality is the idea that the actual meaning of spoken words and gestures are determined by the specific social context in which they occur. Because of indexicality, the same exact spoken utterance or gesture can have entirely different meanings depending on the context in which they are said or performed. This makes the decoding of talk and gestures much more difficult than represented in the conduit view of language. For example, consider a wife saying to her husband, "It's really quite late." This spoken sentence can mean a variety of things and serve a variety of purposes. For example, the sentence could be a statement of a fact, such as if it was past 2 in the morning. It may be an objection. For example, the wife may say this to her husband after her husband says that he would like to remain at the party for a little while longer. This sentence may also be a warning to the wife's husband. Telling the husband that it's late is a way the wife tells her husband that they should go home and get some sleep, or they'll feel terrible in the morning. Because of the indexical nature of language, people use the social context in which talk and gestures occur to determine what the talk and gestures actually mean. For example, consider the utterance, "Hey girls, the drinks are at my place across the street, come on over." The utterance is indexical because it can mean a variety of things depending on who says it and in what context they say it. For instance, imagine that the person who says this phrase is a soccer coach directing her team of 8-year-old soccer players who need some refreshment after a long practice. Now notice how the meaning of the utterance changes tremendously if the context is not a soccer field, but a corporate office, and the person saying it is a manager. The word girls that is applied to people out on the soccer field is an expression that simply communicates the gender of the participants in their stage in life. In the context of a corporate office, however, the same utterance would not convey age, but it certainly would convey gender. If this statement were said by a woman, the word girl wouldn't necessarily be seen as sexist, but rather as a sign of camaraderie. However, if a man said the same utterance, the use of the word girl might be considered sexist and demeaning. Also, the meaning of the term drinks in this utterance changes for each context. On the soccer field, the word drinks probably means non-alcoholic drinks, such as soda and punch. In the corporate office, however, the word drinks would probably refer to alcoholic beverages, such as beer and wine. Nonverbal gestures are also indexical. That is, the same exact gesture can have vastly different meanings depending on the social context. There's no better way to see this than considering the different meanings of the same hand gesture in different cultures and societies. For example, consider the hand gesture that this man is making here in this slide. In the US, this hand gesture means okay, or everything is fine. In Japan, the hand gesture means money. In France, the hand gesture means zero. In Mexico, this hand gesture means sex. In Ethiopia, this hand gesture means homosexuality. In Brazil, this hand gesture is the American equivalent of flipping the bird, so it's very offensive to people. So consider this hand gesture the person in this slide is making. This gesture also has a variety of different meanings depending on the social context. For example, down in the state of Texas, this hand gesture would most likely symbolize the hook'em horns of the University of Texas Longhorns. At a Metallica or Slayer concert, however, this hand gesture means heavy metal. In many Mediterranean cultures, this hand gesture is an insult to a man, and it means that the man has an unfaithful wife. In some parts of Africa, this hand gesture is used to put a curse on somebody, making it a hand gesture that is very dangerous to do. The conduit of meaning view of language has also been complicated by speech act theorists. Speech act theorists have argued that spoken language not only conveys thoughts and feelings to others, rather, people also perform specific actions with the use of language. In other words, people do things with the words that they speak. Often what people do is convey thoughts, feelings, and information to others. However, this isn't all people do with spoken words. For example, consider saying "I do" during a wedding ceremony. According to speech act theorists, this spoken statement performs a particular action, namely the act of promising to another person that he or she will be a loving and faithful spouse. Or consider the spoken statement, I bet you the Bulls will beat the Heat next week. This statement performs a particular action, namely the action of placing a bet. Both of these spoken statements do more than convey information to others, as the conduit view of language would suggest. Rather, these statements also perform specific actions, which in this case are promising and betting, respectively. Now I want to change gears a bit and talk about what social psychologists have to say about how people use language to express intimacy with others and to convey their and other people's status. People often express status and intimacy with spoken forms of address. For example, students usually call me Dr. Sharp because I am higher status than they are. However, my colleagues address me as Shane because we are of more or less equal status. My wife also addresses me as Shane, which denotes a level of intimacy between her and me. Also, many languages have two different versions of the second person pronoun, which is you in English, that speakers use to denote differences in status and intimacy. For example, there is tu versus vous in French, or tu versus usted in Spanish, or du versus sie in German. People use the more formal pronouns to address people of higher status, while people use the informal ones to address people of equal or lower status. People also use the informal versions of the second person pronoun to denote that the speaker has an intimate relationship with the other person. Social psychologists have also shown that people of higher status often express their higher status through the use of speech interruptions. For example, bosses are more likely to interrupt their employees when they are talking than vice versa. Interrupting another person while he or she is talking is a way that people implicitly say that they have higher status than another because they have the right to speak when they want, even if the other person is still speaking. Social psychologists have also shown that people express intimacy by making their speech patterns similar to others. That is, people who wish to express their liking of another tend to shift their own pronunciations, speech rates, vocal intensities, pause lengths, and utterance lengths during conversations to match their partners. Also, to show intimacy, bilinguals, or people who speak two languages, often speak in the language that the other person prefers. To reject intimacy, bilinguals often choose their conversational partner's less preferred language. Many social psychologists have also investigated how men and women interact with one another through the tool of language. According to some social psychologists, in opposite sex social interactions, men try to establish conversational dominance in interactions by interrupting women more often than the women do them. As you just learned, interrupting someone while they are talking is often a way to show higher status. Social psychologists do find that men interrupt women more often, but in same-sex pairs, interruptions of speech are equally distributed amongst conversational partners. Regarding gender and language, in the U.S. there is the common stereotype that women talk a great deal more than men. But this stereotype isn't just found in the U.S., however. As these cultural aphorisms here show, the idea that women talk more than men is a stereotype that spans cultures and continents. There's an English phrase that women's tongues are like lambs, they are never still. A Danish saying that the North Sea will sooner be found wanting in water than a woman at a loss for a word. There's the Japanese saying, where there are women and geese, there's noise. And then there's the Scottish saying that nothing is so unnatural as a talkative man or a quiet woman. Research, however, shows that this stereotype is unfounded. Social psychologists find that in private contexts, men and women talk in similar amounts. Social psychologists also find that men actually talk more than women in the classroom and in the corporate boardroom. Thus, if a person were to judge the differences in how much men and women talk by just focusing on the classroom or the boardroom, he would come to the conclusion that men are quite more talkative than women are. Social psychologists argue that talkative women in the classroom and boardroom are viewed negatively than men who talk the same amount. This is most likely because they are violating implicit gender norms that women should be submissive and silent, and men should be dominant and assertive in their ideas and their opinions in these contexts. Also, in public settings where women and men are given equal amounts of time to talk, men often think that women are getting more than their fair share of talking time. This is because women's amount of talk in public contexts is gauged not by comparison to men, but by comparison with silence. Thus, when women aren't silent, they seem like they are talking too much, which probably leads to the stereotype that women talk more than men. Social psychologists have also investigated how people of different social statuses speak. What social psychologists call standard speech is often associated with high status. Standard speech is often the Queen's English, and it is a type of speech taught in most primary and secondary schools. For example, English standard speech prohibits the ending of a sentence in a preposition or the use of the word ain't. Non-standard speech is anything that's not standard speech. Examples of non-standard versions of English include Black Urban English, the various dialects found in the southern United States, and the various accents found in the boroughs of New York City and the particular neighborhoods in Chicago and other large cities. Non-standard speech is often associated with low status. For example, in an experiment, participants listened to tape recordings of young men and women describing themselves. 4 of the recordings, 2 men and 2 women, were of speakers with standard American accents. 4 others were of speakers with Kentucky accents. On average, students gave the standard speakers higher ratings of status than those who spoke with Kentucky accents, even though they were all saying the exact same thing. Some social psychologists argue that since non-standard speech was deficient in proper vocabulary and grammar, this speech was deficient. They also argued that people who spoke deficient speech were less capable of abstracting complex thought than people who spoke standard English. Given the fact that people of lower statuses in American society, such as racial minorities and the poor, often speak non-standard speech, some social psychologists argue that children from these groups did poorly in school because their language made them cognitively inferior. Thus, it wasn't schools that were failing them, it was the language that they had learned in their homes and communities. However, most social psychologists today argue that the deficiency theory of speech styles and cognitions, as it is called today, is itself deficient. There are several reasons why deficiency theory doesn't make the grade. First of all, few people, even the most educated and learned people that one can think of, speak proper English in all contexts. For example, I know of many professors that in everyday conversation use double negatives and the word ain't. Few would suggest, however, that these people are cognitively inferior just because of this particular type of speech. In fact, social psychologists have shown that context has a great influence on people's speech patterns. For example, people are more likely to use standard speech during a job interview, but are more likely to use non-standard speech when conversing with friends and family. Also, people can express complex and abstract thought using non-standard speech just as well as they can using standard speech. Most non-standard speech differs from standard speech in only pronunciation and grammar. For example, social psychologists who have studied Black urban English have found that it is just as rich and subtle as standard English. Black urban English can be used to communicate a huge variety of things with varying levels of subtlety and nuance. Black urban English mostly differs from standard English by surface qualities only, such as pronunciation and grammatical structure, not by the actual meanings that it can be used to convey. Another problem with the deficiency theory of speech and cognition is that the supposed cognitive inferiority of speakers of non-standard English may be due not to their speech, but how others react to their speech. For example, children who speak in non-standard speech are often punished by their teachers for speaking in such ways in school. Teachers often embarrass children for using non-standard speech when they talk up in class, and they give them low marks when they use non-standard speech during oral presentations. Because of this, children who speak in non-standard forms may not want to talk in class because they are not allowed to express ideas in ways in which they are comfortable, which has the effect of making them seem cognitively inferior. Moreover, IQ and standardized tests are often written in standard English, putting people who think better in non-standard English at a disadvantage. Children who speak non-standard English often perform more poorly on IQ and standardized tests because the tests are not written for them, which makes them seem more cognitively inferior than they actually are. Okay, that's the lecture on language. Next time we'll discuss another way of communicating that we sort of talked about here, and that's emotions. Bye-bye.